You're all very welcome here today. If you don't know us at all, if you don't know the Jesuits, if you aren't Catholic, if you aren't Christian, you're very, very welcome here today especially. We have a great talk this evening. My apologies straight away because I've got to go to another meeting in the building, but I will be back round about the end. Father Paul, the Jesuit Community Superior, will be picking up the Q&A session and wrapping up at the end. And then there are refreshments. There'll be some baskets out. We're going to put some baskets out at the back if you want to make a recommended, not a recommended, that's in my head, okay. It could be in your head now, however much you want to give, okay. 3 or 4 figures is brilliant, okay. That's an awful lot, thank you, okay. And if you can give Danish as well, we'll put some baskets out before the end. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Michael Mazvinsky here today. Michael is, of course, as you know, a descendant of Father John Gerard, Jesuit from almost lost in the midst of time, you might see, in the 17th century. But there was a wonderful BBC documentary. Well, in the end it was wonderful. I hope there's no one here from the BBC tonight, by the way. But in fact,
He's been made a church warden in the Anglican Church.
Fantastic, that's wonderful, yeah. But the original documentary, Michael asked me to mention, was inaccurate about Michael's ancestor, Father John Gerard, in that it implicated him in the Gunpowder plot and called him a traitor. And this, of course, wasn't true. And the wonderful BBC, who we worked with on other things here at Farm Street very well, actually changed the content of the documentary as a result. And it's part of that which Michael's going to speak about tonight, because he's going to put the record straight on Father John Gerard and his contribution to that really important mission of the English Jesuits in the 17th century. So I wonder, before we start to talk, we might just say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Michael Mazvinsky to speak about the Hunted priest, his ancestor, Father John Gerard.
Thank you very much indeed, Father Dominic, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you all for coming, especially those who take a long journey up from Hartford or from elsewhere, especially for doing so. I should say to start with that I don't plan to say too much about my struggles with the BBC, other than to say that once my complaint had actually percolated to the top, which I always knew it would, it was then dealt with in quite exemplary fashion, which I found rather reassuring. I suppose I also have to thank the BBC that as a result of all the research work I had to do to defend my relative, I think I better say, rather than my ancestor, who was very popular with the ladies, but I think I'm actually descended from his brother. I therefore know him a lot better than I did a year ago, and I think I'm much the better for that. Just to avoid confusion, there were in fact 2 series on the BBC in the autumn of 2017 in which Father Gerard featured. The first was a historical drama called Gunpowder, in which Kit Harington of Games of Thrones fame played his great-great-great-great-grandfather Robin Catesby, who was the leader of the Gunpowder plot. There was in that a character called Father Gerard, but who was in fact an entirely fictitious character, who bore absolutely no relation at all to the person I'm going to speak about tonight. I invited Kit Harington, but I don't see him here. The second was the historical documentary Elizabeth I Secret Agent, which was the one for which the BBC accepted that the strong implication that John Gerard knew about the Gunpowder plot in advance was seriously misleading and in breach of editorial standards. Now, I know that most of us here are Catholics, but there are quite a few who are not. There are many of you who have considerable knowledge of this period of English history, and others who perhaps only have a general awareness of the extraordinary religious differences 400 years ago, which have contributed quite significantly to the shape of the society which we live in today. I'm going to start with my tie, on which is engraved, or what do you call it, embossed or printed nowadays, the numbers 1568, 1568. I acquired it in Douai, which we mainly refer to as Dowie in England, because I was there for the last year for the 450th anniversary of the foundation of the English College in 1568 by William Allen to train priests for the English mission at a time when Elizabeth I was on the throne. Catholicism was repressed, Catholics were persecuted, and it was clearly quite impossible to train priests in England. There were, between 1568 and 1600, about 300 priests trained at Dowie, of which about 120 were executed sometime after they got here, mainly hung, drawn and quartered in the barbaric way that they did things in those days. Many others were imprisoned and tortured. The students at Dowie included John Gerard, his cousins St. Edmund Arrowsmith, Blessed Miles Gerard, and a number of other Gerard cousins. The Gerards were quite a large and staunchly Catholic Lancashire family. The English college was thrown out of France in the French Revolution in 1793, and many of them came to Ware in Hertfordshire. And they founded St. Edmund's College, which became a seminary for the training of priests, and a boys' public school where I was a pupil 50 years ago. St. Edmund's, and the headmaster is here tonight, was very proud, and still is, of its Dowie heritage. And in the refectory after lunch, one of the boys would stand up every day and read a passage from the Bible and a brief account of the life of one of the Dowie martyrs. So I grew up knowing quite a lot about the Dowie martyrs, but probably not enough about the context in which these brave men gave their lives for their Catholic faith. That context was extremely complex, so much so that the more I read, the more I learned, the less I thought I understood. And I'm not the only one. It's certainly not as simple as heroic Catholics persecuted by ruthless Protestants. These were uncertain and violent times. Only 100 years since the Wars of the Roses, and more recently Queen Mary had come to power by force, and Lady Jane Grey had been executed after only 9 days as Queen. Hope you thought it worth it. The population had been forced to change religion 3 times in 2 generations. There had been 280 horrific executions, mainly burning at the stake, in the reign of Queen Mary, so that many quite reasonably feared a return to Catholicism. We tend to see Elizabeth as a very strong one, but in reality she was under constant threat. Her right to the throne was continually questioned, mainly by Catholics who doubted the legitimacy of her mother's marriage to Henry VIII. There were therefore numerous plots to overthrow her, mainly involving Catholics. There were hostile attitudes to Catholicism, therefore, for 4 main reasons. One, those who thought the Catholic religion offensive for various reasons, which I haven't got time to go into now. Secondly, this genuine fear of Catholicism returning, for which there is a great deal of evidence in the wills written at the time and other preparations made for such an event. Thirdly, the main fear was a pragmatic one, in that both the government and many of the people were highly concerned about Catholic plots in league with foreign Catholic powers of France and Spain, at a time when Spain was actually quite a lot more militarily powerful than England. An attempted invasion was thought almost inevitable, and would probably be backed by the Pope. And even if Catholics didn't collude to arrange such an invasion, no one knew how many Catholics might support a foreign invader when he arrived. So the strategy was to suppress Catholicism and keep the numbers of Catholics and thus potential rebels to an absolute minimum. Some Catholics contributed substantially to these fears. Pope Pius V issued a papal bull on the 25th of February 1570, in which he declared Elizabeth, the pretended Queen of England and the servant of pride, to be a heretic, and released all her subjects from any allegiance to her. I'm afraid the former head of the Jesuits, Father Persons, put his name to a treatise on the English succession, in which Isabella, daughter of the King of Spain, was named as a possible successor to the English throne. And there were huge divisions among the Catholics themselves, so much so that they make the modern Conservative Party look a picture of unity. The main divisions were quite vicious rows between the so-called appellants and the Jesuits. The Jesuits were, I suppose, the intellectual SAS of the Catholic Church. It was at that time a recently formed religious order with almost military disciplines, which trained priests in the art and with the power of theological argument, and mainly banned them from any involvement in politics. When John Gerard joined the English mission, there were only 6 Jesuits in England, but they wielded influence far beyond their numbers, which was probably resented by some of the secular priests in the country, which numbered about 300, some of which were left over from the reign of Queen Mary. There was a group called the so-called appellants, who were negotiating with the authorities for a relaxation in the persecution in return for certain declarations of loyalty to the Queen and the state. But in those negotiations, they were very happy to dish the dirt on the Jesuits and suggest they were involved in politics and were closely involved with some of the foreign powers earlier mentioned. Who were the key players in all of this? Well, firstly, Elizabeth herself, who famously didn't want a window into the souls of her subjects. She didn't seem to me to be too concerned about the private beliefs of her citizens, provided that they were kept private. Indeed, she supported a number of Catholics in high office, provided they paid lip service to her laws. But she certainly didn't want any relaxation in those laws, because anything which encouraged Catholicism increased the threat of the throne in her view. Then there were the Cecils, William Cecil and his son Robert Cecil, father and son, successively effectively prime ministers of the day, often represented as scheming, manipulative and ruthless, and certainly taking advantage of the Catholic threat to promote their own power, especially when James came to the throne. But some historians now suggest they were actually rather more moderate and pragmatic. And the private letters of Robert Cecil suggest an understanding and sympathetic attitude towards some Catholics, particularly those who were personally known to him. The BBC made a very great play of an intense personal rivalry between Robert Cecil and John Gerard, which I think was grossly overdone, which we'll come to later. Then, of course, we come to James, who came to the throne in 1603. He initially gave great hope to the Catholic cause. His mother, of course, had been a Catholic. There were rumours that he might convert to Catholicism himself, and I think it may be that he even encouraged those rumours for political reasons. Even more so, one of his first acts after acceding to the throne, just after crossing the border into England on his way to London, he conferred a knighthood on John Gerard's brother, Sir Thomas Gerard, at the same time thanking him for the Gerard family's help to his mother, Mary Queen of Scots.
Rumours even reached Robert Cecil, much to his consternation, that the king was planning to meet John Gerard himself and possibly to do a deal with the Catholics behind Cecil's back. But Cecil managed to persuade the king of the gravity of the Catholic threat, perhaps assisted by the fact that some of the Catholics were still plotting. And there was indeed an appellant priest called Father Watson who rather ludicrously thought that by kidnapping the king and getting him alone for an hour he could convert him to Catholicism. It didn't help. So hopes of a relaxation vanished. Indeed, there was an intensification in the persecution. Hopes had been raised only to be dashed. And as John Gerard said, it was like being in a dark room and there's suddenly a flash of light, and once the light's gone, the room seems even darker than it was before. So Catholics were heavily persecuted under the penal laws of 1559 and subsequent amendments. The main acts being the Act of Supremacy, making the Queen Elizabeth the head of the church, and the Act of, I think, Conformity or Uniformity, which meant that everybody had to practice the state religion. There were heavy fines and possible imprisonment for attending Catholic Mass and the sacraments, and I mean very heavy fines. People were obliged to attend Protestant services regularly and to have christenings, weddings and funerals in a Protestant church. Priests coming into the country, for priests to come into the country was regarded as an act of treason, liable to imprisonment, torture and execution, usually being hung, drawn and quartered. There were heavy penalties for harbouring priests, such as having them in your house. This was described as an act of felony, for which the penalty was death. There were priest hunters and spies of Robert Cecil, or William Cecil, in Catholic houses all over the country, and even in Europe, and even in the English colleges in Dowie and Redden. And there were gangs of pursuivants who raided Catholic houses and stripped them bare, searching for priests and searching for priest holes, the tiny little hiding places which were built into the fabric and the structure of Catholic houses so cleverly that they were almost impossible to find. Sometimes these searches would last for many days with a large number of men involved. Before I go on to talk about John Gerard specifically, I want to just tell you my main sources. The two books which many of you will have read, which are probably the best modern books on the subject of the English mission, by Alice Hogg, God's Secret Agents, and Jessie Childs, God's Traitors. Both these ladies were agnostics and would be regarded as impartial. And also the Gunpowder Plot by Lady Antonia Fraser, who is of course a well-known Catholic. There are numerous websites, and I was amazed at the number of them that gave quite detailed descriptions of John Gerard, and they're amazingly consistent and very clear. And of course, finally, the autobiography of John Gerard himself, The Hunted Priest, written at the request of the Jesuits as to help the learning of novices into the Jesuit order. It was written in Latin and translated into English by the Jesuit Father Philip Caraman, and is recognised as one of the most valuable contemporary source documents about the lives of English Catholics during those times. Graham Greene described it as a real-life thriller in the style of John Buckley. In the main, it's recognised as being extraordinarily accurate, even down to quite minute detail. For most, it's a very good read, and the reviews are perhaps best summarised by the Priorian Father Anstruther, who said, "Had John Gerard been a highwayman instead of a Jesuit, his name would doubtless have been familiar to every schoolboy, for his exploits are far more exciting than those of Dick Turpin or Robin Hood, and have the added recommendations that they are authentic." John Gerard was born in 1564 of a Catholic landowner, son of a Catholic landowner with substantial estates in Lancashire and Derbyshire. He was well connected, had friends in high places. His cousin was Master of the Rolls, and this probably served him well in his early years and perhaps even later on as well. He was removed to foster parents at the age of 5, when his father was imprisoned for plotting the release of Mary, Queen of Scots. He went to Exeter College, Oxford, at the age of 13, but he was sent down for refusing to practice the Protestant religion. He returned home, but he took with him his tutor, Mr. Lukeman, whom he subsequently converted to Catholicism, perhaps his first conversion. He went abroad for 4 years to study, first at Douai and then at the Jesuit College of Clermont, north of Paris. But he returned because of ill health and because he wanted to sell some properties to raise funds. He tried to leave again, but this time without a license. You had to have a license to leave the country, and he knew he wouldn't get one. Unfortunately, his ship ran into heavy storms and they had to put back into port. He and 3 other Catholics were arrested. The 3 others were sent to prison. He was sent to live with the Bishop of London, who undertook to convert him to the national religion. Needless to say, the bishop failed, and so he was therefore sent to be imprisoned at Marshalsea Prison, where of course there were numerous Catholics, and he made many valuable contacts which were extremely useful in later life. After 1 year, he was released on bail provided by Anthony Babington, later executed for his role in the Babington plot. And John Gerard escaped to study in Rome, later joining the Jesuits. He joined the English mission, aged 24, in October 1588. He landed by night on the Norfolk coast with a colleague, Father Oldport. This was 3 months after the Spanish Armada had united the nation against Catholicism. Victory had not even been declared. The Armada was expected to come back. All the coast roads were very carefully watched. Catholics were lying low. There was no one to meet him, no one to make arrangements to help. He and Father Oldport were very much on their own. And I read briefly from his book to give you the flavour of it. After crossing the sea, we sailed up the English coast. On the 3rd day, my companion and I saw what seemed to be a good place to put ashore in the ship's boat. As we thought it would be too dangerous for us all to land together, we asked God's guidance in prayer. Then we consulted our companions and ordered the ship to cast anchor off the point until nightfall. At the first watch of the night, we were taken ashore in the boat and dropped. The ship spread its canvas and sailed on. For a few moments we prayed and commended ourselves to the keeping of God. Then we looked about for a path to take us as far inland as possible and put a good distance between us and the sea before dawn broke. But the night was dark and overcast, and we could not pick the path we wanted and get away into open fields. Every track we took led up to a house, as we knew at once when the dogs started to bark. This happened 2 or 3 times. Afraid we might wake people inside and be set upon for attempting to burn, we decided to go off into a nearby wood and rest there until morning. It was about the end of October, raining and wet, and we passed a sleepless night. Nor did we dare talk, for the wood was close to a house. However, in little more than a whisper, we held conference. Would it be better to make for London together or separate, so that if one of us was caught, the other might get away safely? We discussed both courses thoroughly. In the end, we decided to part company and each go his own way. John Gerard made his way on the back roads to Norwich, disguised as a fool, and realising that he would attract attention as a stranger in the country, whenever he saw someone, he went up to them and said, "Have you seen my hawk? I've lost my hawk and I'm searching for it. And can you help me?" And it seemed to work. But he was finally apprehended in a village outside Norwich called Worcester. And he was taken to the constable. And the constable said he was going to arrest him and put him in prison. But for some reason at the last minute he relented and said, "You look an honest fellow. I'll let you go." And To John Gerard, this was just an amazing piece of luck, one of the first of many pieces of luck which seemed to have kept him free on the English mission for so many years to come. And perhaps for what we call luck, he might call divine intervention. Because he had a second piece of amazing luck in a pub in Norwich, where as a result of overhearing a conversation, he identified a Catholic sympathiser. He approached the sympathiser and declared himself. The sympathiser introduced him to a Catholic landowner called Edward Yelbert, who was one of the richest men in Norfolk. He gave him shelter in his house and took him in, and he introduced him to all his Catholic friends. Hence he was launched on his part of the East Anglian mission. For the first 6 years of the mission, he was in East Anglia and London. He moved from house to house, disguised as a country gentleman, wearing the fine clothes of a country gentleman, with all the skills which he had of hunting, falconry, gambling and sword fighting. He was confident in his disguise, he would copy it. On one occasion he found himself gambling with a bishop who became subsequently Archbishop of Canterbury. He was actually a known priest-hater, this bishop. And as he was cornered in argument by John Gerard, he protested and said, how dare you argue theology with the bishop? To which John Gerard said, sorry, I must stop trying to get into theology and stick to gambling. So he identified sympathisers and persuaded them to convert to Catholicism. For some of them, he persuaded them to convert their houses into centres for local Catholics, practically make them into Catholic churches, and install a priest in residence. They were taking incredible risks. In some cases, he took control of the entire house, sacked and replaced untrustworthy servants, and developed in the process an incredible network. He made numerous conversions, about 40 of whom themselves later became priests. And perhaps the most satisfying of them all was the daughter of Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's chief spy master. There were other priests who operated in a similar way, but John Gerard was certainly among the most successful and the most visible. Many of the others spent their time in a very lonely way, operating mainly by night, and certainly not as openly as John Gerard. So how did he do it? Well, he identified prospective targets gradually, and gradually got them round to the subject of religion. He only revealed himself to their astonishment when he sensed their potential to convert. There were huge risks in this, the huge risk of a mistake and being outed by a target. The fact that this never happened suggests amazing judgment on his part, or extreme fortune, or as perhaps as he might suggest, divine intervention. There was a huge risk of being suspected by a spy posing as a loyal servant. This did happen once, as we shall go on, and caused him, as I shall mention later, and caused him to be arrested and imprisoned. He seems to have had enormous powers of persuasion and commanded enormous loyalty, especially from women. And he might be pleased to know that he's still a favourite with the ladies even 400 years later, as I know from some of the eminent lady historians that I've spoken to. I read from Dr. Jessup, who was a Protestant commentator. The extent of Gerard's influence was nothing less than marvellous. Country gentlemen meet him in the street and forthwith invite him to their houses. Highborn ladies put themselves under his direction almost as unreservedly in temporal as well as in spiritual things. Scholars and courtiers run serious risks to hold interviews with him. The number of his converts of all ranks is legion. The very jailers and turnkeys obey him. And in a state of society when treachery and venality were pervading all classes, he finds servants and agents who are ready to live and die for him. A man of gentle blood and gentle breeding, of commanding stature, great vigour of constitution, A master of 3 or 4 languages with a rare gift of speech and innate grace and courtliness of manner, he was fitted to shine in any society and to lead. He survived numerous house searches by pursuivants of the sort that I described earlier. Several days in the hole. I think the biggest one was 9 days in the hole, a priest hole, with nothing to eat and very little room to move. Sometimes inches away from discovery, and the pursuivants somehow, just as they were about to find him, on several occasions got distracted by something else, and it just didn't happen. He was eventually caught as a result of the traitor, who was regarded as the trusted servant of his host. He was imprisoned in foul conditions in the counter in the poultry for several months in trade. Actually, they said the magistrate said to the jailers at the beginning, treat him well, he's a gent. But they didn't. He was interrogated by the London and Middlesex magistrate Young and by Topcliffe, the renowned priest hunter and sadistic torturer of priests. They couldn't get anything out of him, and he was condemned to even worse conditions. But he bribed the magistrate Young and got himself moved to the Clink in Clink Street, Southwark, which, as many of you may know, is there as a museum on the South Bank today, and features quite a lot about Gerard. In the Clink there were much better conditions, and there were numerous Catholics. He bribed the jailer only to visit his cell by prior arrangement, and he later converted the jailer to Catholicism. He said regular mass and gave sacraments for inmates, and even outsiders apparently queued to see. He even organised other priests coming into London, rented accommodation for them, and provided staff. In some ways, this was the most successful period of his time on the mission. Others have certainly operated in prisons as well, other priests successfully. But Garnet says the extent of his success was just quite extraordinary. Father Garnet was his Jesuit superior. But after 3 years, one of the things that really amazes me about this is how the authorities let this happen. With all their spies everywhere, did they know what was going on? How on earth did this happen? But after 3 years, he was transferred to the Tower of London, following the discovery of letters of introduction from 3 young men who wanted to train as Catholic priests, and he was introducing them to the authorities in Rome. He was then interrogated and tortured by Young, Topcliffe again, the Attorney General Sir Edward Cook, and I believe Cecil himself. In the interrogation, they wanted him to admit that he was a priest converting people to Catholicism. This itself was an act of treason which he was happy to confess to. But they wanted more than that, because the government didn't want to be seen as convicting people purely for religious oppression. It wanted to be seen to be responding to a genuine threat to the state. So they wanted him to admit turning people against their loyalty to the Queen. He was faced with the notorious bloody question. That is, what would you do in the event of a conflict between the Pope and the Queen? He was questioned on the doctrine of equivocation. As we all know, for Catholics to swear under oath a lie is a mortal sin. But some of the Jesuits had written to say that in certain circumstances it is entirely justified and legitimate to withhold the truth and to provide misleading information. He was questioned on the whereabouts of his superior, Father Garnet. He was asked the names of all those who had harboured him, which he told them from the beginning he would certainly not be giving. They continually tried to trick him, claiming that they'd had confessions from other prisoners, such as his servant Fulber or his colleague Father Southwood. He had to be very clear thinking in these interrogations, despite the terrible condition he was in as a result of torture. He was tortured on several occasions for a number of hours, mainly hung from gauntlets around the wrists. He was tall, they had to dig the floor away. He got incredible pains in his stomach and chest, and I will read again from his book. They took me to a big upright pillar, one of the posts which held the roof of this huge underground chamber. Driven into the top of it were iron staples for supporting heavy weights. Then they put my wrists into iron gauntlets and ordered me to climb 2 or 3 wicker steps. My arms were then lifted up and an iron bar passed through the rings of one gauntlet, then through the staple, and then through the rings of the second gauntlet. This done, they fastened the bar with a pin to prevent it slipping, and then removing the wicker steps one by one from under my feet, they left me hanging by my hands and arms fastened above my head. After several hours, when asked to confess, he refused, but I could hardly answer in words. Such a gripping pain came over me. It was worse in my chest and belly, my hands and arms. All the blood in my body seemed to rush up to my arms and hands, and I thought that the blood was oozing out from the ends of my fingers and the pores of my skin. But it was only a sensation caused by my flesh swelling above the iron's hold. Father Dominic, when I last met him, asked me what I learned from my studies of Father Gerard, and I suppose the first thing I learned was his incredible faith, incredibly strong, and his absolute certainty about everything. A certainty which some of the historians find admirable and enviable, but also on occasions extremely irritating. Far from fearing death, it seemed he almost looked forward to being with God. And there were a lot of young people around who felt similarly at that time. He hints that he almost wanted the ultimate sacrifice. And it's interesting that the head of the Jesuits at the time expressed some irritation at the number of them being executed, which he put down to carelessness, rather unkindly, I feel. He said it was their job to stay alive, to serve others, not to die, to serve themselves. It's a rather different way of looking at things than perhaps we used to. But just before he was about to be sent for trial, and probably inevitable execution, he made this daring escape from the tower to which Father Dominic referred. It was listed by Time magazine a few years ago as one of the 10 greatest prison escapes in history. He was imprisoned in the Salt Tower, which is on the inner perimeter wall. And he identified that there was another prisoner called John Arden in the Cradle Tower, which was much closer to the moat. And he thought that if they could get a rope, that they might be able to get a rope across that moat and over the wall, from which he could get over the wall and escape by boat. And of course that sounds a great theory, but organising it from your prison cell is quite another matter. How are you going to arrange to get all the equipment necessary, rather a large rope I think, and all the support team in place at the right time? So he bribed the jailer to deliver 2 letters on his behalf, and the jailer accepted, provided he could read them. It's not quite certain whether he could read or not, but he said he wanted to read them. These letters were written in charcoal, and the one was to be delivered to one of John Gerard's friends in the clink, and the other to the prisoner in the other tower, John Arden. But between the charcoal, there was invisible writing in orange juice. And orange juice, as I'm sure many of you know, becomes visible when you heat it up, and it's been used by Catholics in the past. So, having put all the arrangements in place, he bribed the jailer to visit this prisoner John Arden in the Cradle Tower. They got the rope across the moat and over the external wall to the waiting boat, with his friends and colleagues were ready to take him away. The escape is all the more remarkable because in climbing across that rope, his hands were almost unusable because of the torture which he'd been suffering. And by the way, he made his arrangements for the jailer to escape with his family. And the jailer later converted to Catholicism. After the escape, he spent 8 more years on the English mission, mainly in the Midlands, where he wasn't so well known, and therefore it wasn't as dangerous for him as in East Anglia. But he was replicating more or less what he'd done in East Anglia, moving around between all the Catholic houses, encouraging them to set up Catholic mass centres and to make convert their houses into churches. But his main base was at Harrowden Hall, Wellingborough. Has anybody been to Harrowden Hall? No. It's now a golf course. It was then the home of the Fawkes family, spelled V-A-U-X, not to be confused with Guy Fawkes. And his hostess there was Eliza Fawkes, who was a widow. The Fawkes family were massive supporters of the Catholic cause, and Eliza was one of the most important of a number of women who were amazingly brave and helped him and were willing to be executed themselves, as Eliza very nearly was, but for the fact that Robert Cecil took pity on her at the last minute. So now we come to the fact that everything changed and it all came to an end with the Gunpowder Plot, which caused huge damage to the Catholic cause. And whilst everything I have said to you previously is historically uncontroversial, I don't think any historian is going to argue with practically a word of what I've just described, not from what I've read and seen and discussed. But the Gunpowder Plot is a very uncertain affair. Sir Edward Cook, of course the problem with the Gunpowder Plot is that most of the original plotters died before they'd been interrogated. So the evidence for what really took place was never there. And that what there is there, much of it was obtained under torture and is therefore highly unreliable. James came to the throne. I was just going to say, Sir Edward Cook, who was the Attorney General, actually said, at the trial of one of the plotters, he said, future generations are really going to wonder whether this is all fact or fiction. And so we do, to an extent. And of course, what we do know is that James came to the throne in 1603, as I've described. There was a big false dawn. Great hopes were raised. And indeed, he made peace with Spain. But the Spanish, in making peace with England, forgot to make part of that peace that they should make some concessions to the English Catholics. So the Catholic community was really pretty exasperated. And I think from a Catholic perspective, we'd like to sort of, it could be thought that there were some firebrands that were rather out of control, led by Kate. But the first meeting of the plotters took place in May 1604 in a Catholic safe house in London, which was one of 7 rented by John Gerard, but used by many other Catholics and by other Catholic priests. And after the meeting, the plotters moved next door to another room in which they heard Sunday Mass. 2 of the plotters, one under torture and one under the threat of torture, the rack, were persuaded to name John Gerard as the priest who said the Mass. But even those 2 said that he knew absolutely nothing about the plot, and they had no intention of letting him know anything about the plot. John Gerard denied that he knew about the plot, but also under oath denied that he said that Mass. What we do know is that Father Garnet, the head of the Jesuits, and another Jesuit priest, Father Testament, did have some foreknowledge that something was going on. To what extent that the detail was known, I don't know. But they had most of that knowledge through the confession. And it might sound strange to others, but for Catholics the seal of confession is really something quite absolute, and you're not allowed to reveal anything heard under confession, which therefore put them in a massive dilemma. We have evidence, strong evidence, that Father Garnet tried to talk Catesby out of the Gunpowder plot, or out of whatever plot he was planning. We also have evidence that he appealed to the Pope to ban any violence by English Catholics. But Cecil wanted to blame the Jesuits. He didn't just want to say that they knew the plot was going to take place. He wanted to place the Jesuits at the forefront of the plot. He wanted to say this is inspired and led by Jesuits. And he named Gerard, Garnet and Tesserman in that order. He may have genuinely seen Gerard as the greatest threat and the ringleader, but despite all the means of interrogation and torture available, he failed to get any credible evidence to that effect. John Gerard, of course, denied that he had any knowledge of the plot, although he did acknowledge at the time that he had certain suspicions that something was up, caused by changes in the lifestyle of one of the plotters, Gerard Digby, who'd been brought into the plot at the last minute. Only one person was ever persuaded to implicate John Gerard under torture, but he later withdrew that allegation. And even the two who said the Mass said he knew nothing of the plot. Sir Everard Digby said that they deliberately withheld any knowledge of the plot from John Gerard because they knew he would try and talk them out. He had a history against violence. He'd revealed a previous plot to the authorities. There were, of course, many such plots, and having some suspicions is a judgment. Which one are you going to follow up on? Which one do you take seriously? But I said, with all Cecil's methods, he failed to pin any credible evidence on it. But let's just think as well about an intelligent man looking at the practical consequences. The failure of the Gunpowder plot was an absolute disaster for English Catholicism. But what if it had been a success? At least arguably it would have been an even greater disaster. Can you imagine blowing up all of those people, many Catholics but included? I don't think Catholics would have been very popular. And so, quite apart from the fact that for a man who believes in God, to bless an act of mass murder seems to be far-fetched, in the absence of any significant evidence. Alice Hogg, one of the authors I quoted earlier, concludes he probably knew something of some kind was up, but she very much doubts that he had any idea of the scale or horror of what was proposed. In conclusion, he was clearly a very remarkable man, perhaps one of the most remarkable among many, and of all of those brave men and women. He seems to have had amazingly strong faith, bordering on complete certainty. He probably would have been martyred and perhaps canonized if he hadn't actually escaped from the tower. And I suppose that in concluding, I think that perhaps we should be thinking tonight about all those many people suffering religious repression today around the world in many countries, which perhaps I won't name, but I think most of us are familiar with some pretty important countries where people, not just of Catholic or Christian religion, but of many other religions, are persecuted in not a dissimilar manner to the sort of thing that's happening. Perhaps we should also reflect on how lucky most of us have been living in a country which since the last war has been pretty amazingly tolerant. And we should perhaps be hoping that that tolerance continues, but perhaps hoping with some caution and some determination to make sure it does. Because I think many of us are concerned that there is a rise of intolerance of other people's views, and that we are all encouraged to follow a certain prescribed agenda in the modern world as opposed to following our own beliefs. And it's amazing to me in a way that here we're talking about a time when uniformity was imposed by the law. Discrimination was imposed by the law. Now, discrimination is illegal. But actually, is it? Are there just different sorts of discrimination emerging in different ways? I leave it at that. Thank you all very much.